Hi, and welcome back to the online study of preparing for PPA certification. We're now on Section E in the lighting section of the test specifications. E says, determine the appropriate lighting usage, main, fill, etc., for the subjects. With 6 items on the exam, this is a pretty large section for us to go through, so let's get right into it. Number 1 begins, knowledge and placement of main, key, fill, background, accent lights to achieve desired effects. In other words, control shadows, create depth, enhance subject matter. You know, we always begin with the consideration of where is the light coming from. So in any environment, I am looking for the light, and especially the light that I'm going to use as my main light that's going to illuminate the subject. And so that's kind of my first consideration. Outdoors, obviously indoors, or if you're working with off-camera flash, that becomes your main light. In your studio, you set up a main light, perhaps a fill and some others. And you've got to figure out, what do you want that main light to do? Well, it really has 2 jobs. Its first job is to create texture and detail. Texture and detail in the clothing, to give you form and shape to your subject, a shape to a face. Also to put a mask of light on the face that flatters the subject. In other words, think of lighting as something that is actually painted onto a face. So you're painting on a mask. You want to paint the most flattering style of light onto that subject's face possible. And so your first consideration is, what should that light be doing? You know, sometimes we want a flat lighted subject, maybe in a fashion photograph or in a photograph of glamour style. Flat lighting is a good choice. You may also analyze the subject and say, well, you know, there may be some blemishes here, some things that I want to try to hide and not accentuate. So again, flat lighting is a great choice. So whether you're outdoors or in the studio, where is the flat light coming from? Well, in outdoors, we've talked about, we like to work with a soft light source, and that generally comes from sunlight bouncing off of another structure, usually a building or maybe some overhead sky that kind of comes in underneath the canopy to provide some directional light. If you want flat light, you simply turn the subject towards that light. In the studio, if you want flat light, you simply bring the main light near the front of the subject and behind the camera, or you can set up a pattern where lights are on either side of the subject at 45 degrees at the same power, same output, same lighting modifiers. That also gives you a very flat lighting. But that's not typical of what we want. Generally, we want a directional light where the light rakes across the body, creating texture and detail in the clothing, and to create hopefully a short lighting pattern on the face by turning the person's head back towards the light. Because you see, when you turn away from the light, that's naturally putting you in a broad lighting pattern. So it's kind of a 2-step process. You turn the body away from the main light so that it rakes across the body, but then you turn the head back towards the light, and that gives you a short lighting pattern instead of a broad lighting pattern. You know, in the CPP process, I often hear people say, well, I don't have studio lighting. I can't do all those lighting patterns. You absolutely can. You can do everything in the studio that you can do outdoors. Actually, outdoor lighting is kind of what we're simulating when we come into the studio. Here's a great example of using split light. I'm using split light here by using window light, and here's a studio example of using split light. So both of these lighting patterns can be produced with natural light or with artificial light. You know, sometimes the environment gives us a cloudy day, and cloudy days, as we saw in an earlier study, kind of create dark shadows in the eyes and create an unflattering lighting pattern on the subject. And so sometimes I just work with it. I'll turn my subject's face up towards the sky and just do something a little creative by having high overhead light. I can also reproduce that same look in the studio. Here I've done it by using a strip light overhead, which would normally be a hair light if the subject was looking at the camera, but now it's being used as a main light as it's coming down and lighting the subject from above. We've already talked a bit about the fill light in Section D, but here it shows up again in Section E. Remember, the fill light is traditionally placed behind the camera, but it doesn't have to be. It could be placed at 45 degrees to the subject. It could actually be placed anywhere, for that matter, even to the side of the subject. It just depends on what you want as your final result. Typically speaking, though, remember you want that fill light to be a large light source so that it doesn't create secondary shadows, and that entire job of that fill light, whether it's a light itself or a reflector, is to control the contrast of the difference between highlight and shadow. So if you want a little more even lighting pattern, then you bring in a little bit more fill. If you want a more dramatic lighting pattern, then you reduce the fill. Now we're going from main light and fill light to adding some supplemental lights that really do some really nice treatments to our images. The first one we'll talk about here is a hair light. The job of the hair light is to create separation between the subject and the background and to create detail in the hair. In this example, the hair light is placed just up above the subject's head and slightly to the back, and really does a nice job of adding interest and textures and separation of the hair. Not that we needed it here so much against this background, but if you take a subject that has very dark hair and you're photographing them against a dark background, then a hair light's almost imperative to create that separation, because otherwise the hair blends into the background. We've talked about that a little bit earlier in another study as well. It should not spill into the subject's face. You can get the hair light too far forward and it begins maybe to light up the nose. That's not what you want. So remember, the placement of the hair light is above the subject's head. It could be off to one side or the other a bit, but generally overhead and generally to the back side of the head so as not to spill onto the subject's face. Another important lighting tool might be a background light. And again, its job is to create separation between the subject and the background. It may also be simply to raise the illumination of a background, especially in an environmental portrait where the background may be getting too dark. So adding a little bit of light into the background or onto a background really does help create separation and maybe added interest if the background is an important part of a scene. You might also make note that if the background is a distraction and isn't really contributing to the image, then you might not want to light that background so much. But what I like about this particular background light and the way I've used this is that it's not just putting random light onto the background. I've positioned it low enough behind the subject and kind of angled the light slightly upward to give sort of a mottled effect to that black paper. Yes, that image on the right is black seamless paper, but with a light on it, it's picking up some really nice gray tones that ultimately fade into the darker tones the higher up it goes. In this example, I'm photographing on location at a class, and as I'm doing this window lit portrait, I felt like the background was simply getting way too dark. All I did was turn on the hallway lights, and that provided enough ambient light into the background to give it a little bit more detail back there, but more importantly to create separation from the subject, her hair, and the background. The next light we'll talk about is an accent light or a kicker light. The kicker light's job is to create, again, somewhat separation between the subject and the background, but it's also to help define the shape of the subject or define depth within a subject as that light strikes from behind and creates a really nice highlight along the outer edge of the subject, in this case along the edge of her jawline and her cheek. It's a specialty light which defines and sculpts the subject by adding strong highlights onto the subject, which add interest and creates form or separation. One of the tricks here is to make sure that you're not letting that kicker light angle too much towards the camera so that you pick up unwanted lens flare into the lens. And the other thing that you remember, we haven't talked about it yet, but one of the other things you might think about is the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflectance. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the study, but let's just say if we take a rubber ball and we throw it against a wall and it comes right back at us, that ball comes off at the angle that it hits, right? If we take that same ball and we throw it at a 45-degree angle onto the wall, it's not coming back at us. It's coming off at 45 degrees the opposite direction. So the light does the same thing. And in the case of presenting a kicker light like this, the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflectance. So as you kind of work that light into the angle behind the subject, it's kind of interesting. You'll see when you hit that angle to where the angle of the light striking the subject is equal to the angle of the light striking the camera, you get a really strong highlight. If you take that same light and you start moving it along the path of the circle back towards the 90-degree point, back towards the main light, it becomes more of a flat light again. So it's kind of interesting the way that works, but you'll see it if you experiment with that with your own lighting kits. In this example, I'm just using the ambient light in the environment to create my kicker light or my accent light. I'm using just a little bit of flash fill, a nice diffused flash fill from the front to illuminate the subject, and I've isolated them into a pretty uniformly dark background. But just off to camera right, there's some open sky that's coming in from the backside of the subjects, and that's what's really giving me my hair light and my accent light and kicker light. So this is a great setup. You learn to see these things when you're working in the environment, and the more you study this in CPP and the more you practice it, the more it becomes second nature, and you say, fill light, main light, kicker light, hair light, and man, it takes no time to find the light in the environment where you're working. Number 2 says, knowledge of techniques for controlling or utilizing the light, including natural light, window, outdoor, studio, mixed, incandescent, fluorescent, and painting with light. In controlling natural light, at first glance you might think, well, I can't control the natural light. Oh, you've got lots of tools at your disposal for controlling natural light. You've got everything from reflectors, from scrims to flags, all the things that we talked about a little bit earlier on. These are all wonderful tools to help you control your natural light. Translucent panels may be utilized to modify hard sunlight and turn it into a larger and therefore softer quality of light by letting that sunlight pass through that panel. Subtractive lighting tools can also be employed outdoors. Remember, we talked in subtractive lighting about using our black reflector overhead to create something of a canopy so that forces the light to come in from the side. These are all wonderful tools that we've talked about, but all wonderful tools that you can employ in controlling your outdoor lighting. I don't know a photographer who does not absolutely love window light. If you have your best choice, you would have a north-facing window light, because window light is at its best when no direct sunlight is coming into the window. And with a north-facing window, the sun never comes in through that window. So kind of the trick here is to find the right time of day for that window. There may be locations where a window is better used in the morning, or it may be better used in the afternoon, evening, so when the sun is not coming directly through that light. A window light could also be modified with translucent panels. You could put the panels up inside the window. You can actually set the panels up outside the window to filter that sunlight if it's coming in through the window. You'll see that in a lot of photography studios where they've got panels set up inside their window. Curtain shears will kind of do the same thing. Window light may also benefit from reflector fill. I don't know of many occasions where a reflector isn't really helpful with window light, because you don't always have that exact control. You're not always there at exactly the right time of day. So that reflector helps us reduce some of the contrast that can be created when you're using window light. Again, we've talked about subtractive lighting, but it's almost always necessary when you have overcast and cloudy days. That subtractive lighting just helps eliminate those high overhead light sources that tend to create the really dark shadows in the eyes, light up the cheeks, unflattering lighting for sure. And so your choices are going to be to use some sort of subtractive lighting technique, or to use an additive lighting technique, to use a fill flash, a softened fill flash, to come in and become your main light, and then just use the ambient light, the high overhead light, as something of a fill light. So off-camera flash is a great tool to employ outdoors in controlling soft diffuse lighting that's high overhead. Another tool that we have at our disposal is the time of day that we go out. You know, landscape photographers don't go out at high noon because high overhead lighting is flat lighting on the landscape. Landscape photographers love to pick up the textures and details of the sand and the sea and the flora and the fauna. So when does that happen? Well, that happens early in the morning or late in the evening as the sunlight starts raking across the earth. That's where we pick up dramatic texture and detail. The highlights and shadows as the sun skims across the earth are just marvelous for capturing that kind of detail in a landscape photograph. Inevitably, when you're working in environmental situations with natural light or artificial light that's ambient light within the scene, you're going to deal with mixed lighting sources. We've talked a little bit about that already when we talked about filters, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on than in the study. But the test specifications talk about mixed lighting here. So one of the considerations that you're going to have in working with mixed lighting situations is how are you going to deal with that? And you know, there's a couple of ways we can deal with that. We can either gel a light so that it matches the light of the ambient light so that you don't have mixed color. The other thing that's also sometimes recommended is to shoot in RAW and to balance those color adjustments in production. So you can do that as you're processing your RAW files and then ultimately create a balanced pair of images that you can merge together to bring those color values together. I think it's a whole lot easier to do it right there in camera and to gel the light, which is why I like to carry color correction gels with me for my flash. I can color balance my flash to fluorescent lights, to tungsten lights, and that's what I'm generally going to encounter. And if I just balance my flash, then I don't have a whole lot of post-production work to do in color balancing. So let's examine these situations and see what solutions we might find. In this scenario, we're going to be photographing at a church, and the church is illuminated with tungsten light. The color values could easily range between 2800K and 3400K, and your flash is daylight balanced at approximately 5500K. So the trick here is to use a CTO filter, which means color to orange. We're going to put that CTO filter on our flash, which is now going to make our flash look more like a tungsten light, and we're going to set the white balance on our camera to the tungsten setting or to approximately 3000 or 3200K on our Kelvin settings in our camera, so that now everything's balanced when we shoot and we don't have that mixed lighting problem. In situations where filtering the light's not practical, then capturing in RAW is probably that best solution. The key there is to shoot in RAW so that you have that latitude for that processing. Remember, processing in JPEGs does not give you nearly the latitude to be able to make those types of adjustments. Painting with light is another wonderful photographic technique. There's a couple variations on painting with light. My good friend John Hartman does a fantastic job of painting with light. You should look him up when we're done with this video and look at some of his work, John Hartman. In this technique, we're looking to light up a product, an interior, or any other subject that might be difficult to light in its natural environment or even with any kind of traditional lighting setup. The idea here is that we're going to add layers and layers and layers of light onto our subject over a long period of time while the shutter remains open. That's right, open. And you say, well, gosh, is that going to blur things? Well, it certainly would if you left the lights on. So for example, in an interior room, you might want all those lights off so that the room is completely dark. And then in your painting with light technique, you're going to go around with some sort of a constant light and literally paint the subject with that light. You'll go over and over and over different areas that you want to highlight, being careful not to overlap areas that you've already recorded light. Remember, that shutter's open the entire time, and you've also got to remember not to get into the way of the shutter so that it sees you and records your movement, or it records you blocking light that you're painting. So generally I would do this off camera and use it to sort of fill in again those areas where I want to highlight, being careful not to let the light spill where I don't want it to go. And yes, there's a lot of technique that you would have to practice to be able to get this done well. I don't think the exam's going to ask you a whole lot about the technique and the exposures, but it is going to just ask you to recognize the technique in painting with light. And that again would be a situation where you're using a long exposure in a rather darkened environment to add layers of light where you want it by gently brushing it in or painting it in with your light source. Here's one that I did of a theater in a downtown area near me. If you take a picture with just your flash, then the whole thing looks flat and ugly and has no characteristics to it at all. If you don't use the flash and you want to record the marquee, well, the building goes completely black. So the key here is to use a painting with light technique with my flash. So what I did is I calculated the exposure of the marquee at a really slow shutter speed. Like, for example, I think it might have been around 30 seconds maybe, and that had me shooting this at around maybe f22. I don't really remember the exact settings here. Needless to say, it was a very small lens opening and a very long exposure. And so during the course of the exposure, while the shutter remains open, by the way, you can do this using the bulb setting on your camera, and if you've got a cable release that you can lock that shutter down during the course of the exposure, or you can simply just use very slow shutter speed times like 30 seconds or 60 seconds. And then I go in with my flash off camera and I start painting that building with that flash. I'm going to make several exposures. That's not really true. I'm going to take several bursts of that flash during that single long exposure. So I'm going to add some light up under the marquee. I'm going to add some light over in the box office and over on the left side. I'm going to angle my light and photograph some of the tops of the building, and just so that I can get enough light throughout that entire scene that it doesn't look flat and it doesn't look harsh and it's not overpowering the marquee. And with just a little bit of practice, this was the result. It gave me a really nice usable image of this old theater with this painting with light technique. Number 3 says knowledge of backlighting for producing desired effects. Backlighting can be wonderful. It can also be a real hazard. Backlighting occurs when the lighting in the background is stronger than the lighting on the subject. And if you're going to use that particular environment to photograph in, then you're going to have to figure out, how am I going to introduce enough supplemental light onto the subject to balance the backlighting in the background so that it does not overpower my subject. For me, I just try to avoid it most of the time. I find a medium to dark background is my best choice. I can introduce my off-camera flash, and it's so subtle it looks natural, and I don't have to deal with the problems of backlighting. But in some cases, there's no working your way around it. A great example of that might be that you've got a photograph, let's say a couple who wants to be underneath a gazebo. Well, the lighting overhead is going to be blocked completely off of them. They're going to be in the shadow of that gazebo, but on the back side of that gazebo, here's this bright light that you have to contend. So here are some real world examples. In this image, this bride is standing underneath the gazebo, so the lighting in the background is full sunlight. It's an F16 at 125 kind of day, if you know what I mean. And so my job here is going to be to bring in enough supplemental light into the front to balance the light on the subject to the lighting in the background. If I take the exposure off the subject and take the image without that supplemental light, then I'm completely blowing out the background, which is totally unacceptable. In this image, I've brought in my fill flash and set it about one stop less than F16, hoping to get it to fire at about F11, and that gives me enough light on the subject to allow me to maintain the detail of the background and create a nice balance of light on the subject in the background. Constant lights such as LED video lights may also provide enough illumination onto the subject to do this sort of thing if you're not quite as comfortable with your flash. I doubt a reflector would be enough to solve this situation because you're not going to be able to get enough light on the reflector underneath the gazebo. You know, in some bad backlighting situations, it may be possible that at least some portion of that background is better suited for the exposure. So in this example, I selected a telephoto lens that would isolate the best part of the background, which allows me to photograph my subject against that backlit background, but not include the brightest part of that background. Other techniques may include trying to reduce the overall exposure of the background by blocking some or all of the light with a gobo or a scrim. Now there's just a lot of environments where that's not possible, but if it's a smaller area that you're working in, then that may be just the ticket. Some backlighting issues may be solved by using several images at separate exposures and then working with them in your editing software to create a final acceptable image. Now here's backlighting used as a rim light. The backlighting is really strong. If she turns towards that light, it would be pretty bright and pretty intense. But this was a scenario where I found a nice medium to dark background that I could use, and then just allow that ray of sunlight that's striking across the back of her to create a really nice rim light on her hair. I love this technique in natural lighting. You can use either a reflector or just a gentle fill flash to illuminate the subject, but the sun and the environment creates that really nice rim light in the back. Sometimes when the background is so bright and so intense, it's best not to fight it. Let's go ahead and expose for it and then produce a silhouette. That's exactly how you do a silhouette. You measure the brightest part of the sky. It's the one time where your in-camera meter works really, really well. You point your camera at the brightest part of the sky, you set your camera so that the meter goes right to the center, and then you back up and compose that image at the same f-stop and shutter speed you just read off the sky to photograph your subject. Now, again, when you reposition your camera this way, the camera's going to see the dark foreground, the dark trees, the dark subject, and that meter's going to go haywire. But remember, you measured the light on that sky. You measured that bright backlight background. And so you're going to produce this type of result by following what the meter said in the sky and just going with the fact that you've got an intensely bright backlit situation. Let's just go with it and make something wonderful out of it. Number 4 says knowledge of lighting products, including reflective, transparent, translucent, and opaque. Product lighting in commercial photography is really, that's a highly specialized form of photography that I've done quite a bit of in my career, but it's something that those people who do this every day and earn a good living at it, I just think they're geniuses. Along with the sports photographers who do high-end sports photography, I think they're also geniuses. But let's figure out what we need to learn for the purposes of CPP about product lighting. Some products are going to have us deal with highly reflective surfaces. Anytime you deal with a product that has a lot of highly reflective surfaces, the key to that is to use a really, really large light source. We're talking large soft boxes, the light tint that we saw a little earlier, really large scrims overhead to really spread that light over a broad area, because the smaller the light source, the more specular highlights we're going to produce in that reflective surface. And the goal with that big broad light source is to take what would be a really specular highlight and to spread it out over a much larger area, which helps us define the shape and form of that product. You know, it's sort of obvious, but let's talk about it. The key here is that you're really photographing reflections of everything that surface is capable of bouncing back at you. So that's going to include everything from light stands to you and your camera and your tripod and the light. And so it's important to try to work in a scenario where you're controlling the reflections in that product. And we'll just look at a couple of easy examples that I did. In this image of the cake topper, the letters don't pick up the quality of what that material is made of. If I use my direct flash, then it's just kind of a flat and brightly reflected highlight coming back at me, and it just didn't really pick up the texture or the quality of the letters. So I employed a bounce flash technique. I'm taking my little tiny light source, which is a flash, and turning it into as large a light source as I can on the fly at this wedding. And by bouncing it off the ceiling, that light source became large enough that as it reflected in the letters, I was able to really illuminate the letters fairly nicely and pick up some of the characteristics and the texture of those letters by bouncing that flash off the ceiling. Transparent products such as glassware also benefit from large light sources and backlighting. Glassware can oftentimes be presented through simply lighting the background and allowing the background to show through the object. In this image, I actually used the natural window light inside the reception hall with a little bit of bounce flash to illuminate this subject. The problem is it's far enough away from the tables that the window light sources look rather small, so they show up as really distracting little pinpoints of reflected light in the glassware and do very little to define the shape of the globe. In this image, I photographed this bottle which was being shared between a bride and her sisters, and I knew if I used direct flash on this bottle, it's just going to be an ugly glare coming back at me. So again, I employed my bounce flash technique off the ceiling to turn that little strobe into a much larger light source, which helped me in photographing the glassware, giving it a little bit of shape. Still not ideal, but certainly an improvement over what it would have been like had I used direct flash. With this image, I simply chose to photograph the candle in the church window using only the backlighting of the window. Again, if I had employed my flash here, it would have been just a hard little specular highlight that would have really taken away from the nature of the image. Also in this environment, the ceiling was so high, bounce flash wasn't going to help me here. So I felt like it sort of gave me the look and the feel of what they had in mind when they placed that there in the first place. In the studio environment, dimension and shape can be accentuated by using pieces of white and black foam core to reflect onto the object surface. Translucent products also benefit from a large light source as well as well-placed reflectors. Backlighting is often employed to help define the value of the translucency of the object and provide definition to the shape and form as needed. This frosty mug at Wright was nicely lit with a large window behind the table, so the backlighting really shows off the translucence of the mug and of the beer. Opaque items. The list of opaque items one might encounter is huge. The task is to define the shape, texture, and details of the product, as well as its color. Soft lighting is frequently used in product photography in order to showcase the product without unwanted shadows. Again, this is where a softbox, a large softbox, or a lighting tent is invaluable. To create this image, I positioned my softbox above and slightly to the left so that I could create just enough shadow and highlight on the bins to give them a sense of depth. With this image, I used a large umbrella to the left to skim the light just across the front of the machine. The soft shadows of the skimming light provide depth and a bit of three-dimensionality to the device. I also used a large sheet of white foam core to the right as a reflector to bounce some of the light back so that the lighting was still pretty even. Number 5 says, knowledge of the use of fill flash techniques, indoor and outdoor, and the Sunny 16 rule. Well, let's start with the Sunny 16 rule. This is a very basic fundamental exposure guide for outdoor lighting environments. The rule basically gives you lighting conditions and a starting exposure for each of those lighting conditions, which is fairly easy to remember. The Sunny 16 rule looks like this. If the lighting outdoors is sunny, then the starting exposure would be f16 and the shutter speed would be equivalent to 1 over the ISO. So for example, if you were using 100 ISO, then the shutter speed would be 1/125th. We're going to round up 100 ISO to the closest shutter speed. So f16 at 125 is the starting exposure on a sunny day at 100 ISO. On a partly cloudy day, the starting exposure is f11 at 1 over the ISO. On an overcast day, it's f8, and on a heavy overcast day, it's 5.6. So remember, each of the lighting patterns, the f-stop is the given, f16, f11, f8, and 5.6. The shutter speed is always determined by the ISO that's being used. So once again, on a heavy overcast day, if I'm using 100 ISO, then my exposure would be 5.6 at 125. But if you're standing right beside me and you're using 400 ISO, then your starting exposure would be f5.6 at 1/500th of a second. Now remember, that's a starting point. We can still work through all of the equivalent exposures to come up with our pairing of numbers. We talked about that early on in equivalent exposures, but if we go back to Sunny 16 at 125, then I can use f11 at 250, f8 at 500, 5.6 at 1000, f4 at 2000, 2.8 at 4000. That's coming off the top of my head. That comes from memorizing those f-stops and shutter speeds. You should do the same. Here's an example of photographing on a heavy overcast day using 400 ISO. The starting exposure would be 5.6 at 1/500th according to the Sunny 16 rule. But you might like to increase your depth of field, so you want to move from 5.6 to f16. Can we do that? Of course we can. Following through the equivalent exposures, 5.6 at 500 is equal to f8 at 250, or f11 at 125, and f16 at 160. Remember, the lens openings are getting smaller, so the shutter speeds have to get slower. In this example, we're photographing on a sunny day at 100 ISO. The starting exposure will be f16 at 125 according to the Sunny 16 rule. We're going to photograph some kids who are riding bicycles, and we want to freeze them in motion to make it look like they're stopped. So how are we going to do that? Well, we've got to increase the shutter speed. Let's see if we can get it to 1000. Remember, starting at f16 at 125, the equivalent exposure is f11 at 250, f8 at 500, and 5.6 at 1000. Remember, in each example here, I'm opening up the lens one stop. That means I've got to speed up that shutter by one stop as well. And so for every step I open up, I have to speed up that shutter. All of these equal the same amount of light reaching the sensor, but f5.6 at 1/1000th will allow us to stop the motion of the kids riding their bikes. Number 5 says, knowledge of using fill flash techniques, indoor and outdoor, and the Sunny 16 rule. While it may not be ideal to photograph a subject in full sun, sometimes there's simply no choice. The hard lighting of full sun is going to create strong shadows which may be objectionable. So in these situations, a portable strobe is invaluable to help fill some of those hard shadows. In this example of the bride and groom, the full sun on the bride and groom was an exposure of f16 at 125 according to the Sunny 16 rule. I knew that I was going to have to introduce some flash into this scene because with the bride having her back towards the sun, her face was going to be completely dark from shadows. So my goal here was to set the flash 1 f-stop less than f16 because I want it to just gently fill the shadow side, not balance the shadow side to the backlit sun, because that would look kind of strange to have bright light coming in from the front and the bright light coming in from the back. So by reducing the fill flash by 1 stop, it looks a lot more natural on the bride's face, and it still allows me to record the full intense sun that's lighting up her dress and the groom's from the front. If you get rid of all the shadows, the image appears flat. So by reducing the output of the fill flash by 1 stop, we get a lot more natural look to the scene. I think it's important to add here that because it was an f16 at 125 exposure with full sun, that's the exposure that I used on my camera. I set the flash to record 1 stop less at f11. If I had done this at f11 instead of f16, I would have overexposed the entire scene. So I'm okay with properly exposing the scene at f16 and then letting the flash come in and fill at f11. I still can see detail in the bride's face, which is important, but I'm not overexposing the entire scene. Had this been, let's say, an overcast day, which would be f8 at 125 with 100 ISO, I might have had a couple of options here. Probably in this case, I would have gone ahead and shot at f8 and allowed the flash to go 1 stop less at 5.6. But what if I had them turn towards me? Now remember, the overall lighting on an overcast day is coming from everywhere, so they're not going to be backlit, they're not going to have light coming in from the front, it's going to be coming in from everywhere. If the exposure is f8 at 125, I have a choice of using my flash at f8 and moving it off camera slightly. That's going to give me a bit of directional light coming in from the flash, and then I can use the ambient light as the fill. But if the ambient light is f8, and which is also the fill, and my main light is f8, that's going to be pretty flat lighting, isn't it? I could increase the output of my flash to f11. That would give me at least a 2-to-1 ratio if I set the camera to f11. So the flash is going to be measuring f11. That's how I'm going to set the exposure. The fill light would be f8, which would produce a nice directional lighting on the subject. Also, the background's going to appear just a little bit darker than it would have had I photographed that overcast day at f8. By photographing it at f11, I'm underexposing it a bit. But I'm okay with that because it gives me a nice pattern of light on the subject and it reduces the lighting on the background, which really makes the subject stand out. So a lot of technique employed here. Now we're not done with this section, but we're already almost an hour into this video. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop the production on this section right here for now, and then I'm going to pick up an entire video on just the flash portion of the test specifications. I think that's one section that you might want to watch over and over, and so having it on its own video I think will be helpful to you when it comes time to reviewing that material. So I'm going to stop here for now. It's not quite done, but I'll see you back for part 2 in just a bit.